I am an engineer at Quip. Before, basically spent the last 10 years working in Silicon Valley. I also, probably the most interesting thing I've done in the past, before I joined Quip, I took about a year off to write a book called The Effective Engineer, where I ran around Silicon Valley and just interviewed leaders from different companies. So places like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, like Lyft, Square, Reddit, Instagram, and basically just collected a lot of stories. What are the things that their teams do that enable them to be really effective? What are the biggest mistakes that they've made? What are some of the investments that they've made that made the highest returns? So I thought that maybe one thing that might be interesting for your audience, I'm sure that you probably have like a lot of students who sort of read your blogs, and probably a lot of people that are in computer science. One area that I'm like really passionate about is just about teaching software engineers the tools and mindsets about how to more effectively build their careers, build products, build teams. And so I thought I'd cover sort of 3 common mistakes that new engineers make.
Okay, cool. So 3 common newbie mistakes.
Yeah.
Good. I like this framing, and this is something that I guess you wish that maybe people would learn. Do you feel like these things are something that people can learn in school, or they have to learn once they're on the job? The stuff you're going to cover.
I think they're definitely things that they can learn in school. I think particularly if you do more hands-on classes, or like even if you do a PhD, I think those prepare you for the engineering world in certain aspects that maybe aren't traditionally taught in colleges. They're definitely all very learnable skills. I think none of them are skills that I would consider you're born with. But I think a lot of people just don't pay attention to them. Because one thing I've done, spent a lot of time doing, is just like mentoring new engineers who join teams. Like at Quora, I spent a lot of my energy building the onboarding and mentoring programs for new engineers. And so these are also some of the mistakes I see a lot of newer engineers make.
Alrighty, so the suspense has built up. All right, go for it.
Yeah, I think like probably the biggest one that a lot of people go into engineering with, the biggest misconception that engineers go into the field with, is thinking that the amount of impact that they create is equal to the technical skill that they have. I think that's like coming out of school, you're really focused on what are all the concrete things that you learned in school. When you go to do interviews with companies, you get asked about algorithm questions, or like how to do something, and it's all just very like technical. I think as a field, we haven't. I think companies have still yet to figure out the best way to interview people, and they sort of default to interviewing your technical skills. But there's a lot of different, I think, pieces that go into whether you are an effective engineer, and a lot of those skills aren't technical. And so sort of one example is just like figuring out how to prioritize like what to work on. I think, when you're, for example, if you're like a grad student, then you probably spend a lot of time thinking about like what you should be working on, because the projects that you work on are so open-ended and you sort of work so independently. But I think a lot of people don't actually spend as much time thinking about like what is the next thing I should be focusing on. And that's not a very technical skill, but like sort of where you choose to apply your time is definitely very important in terms of like what you get, what output you create. So I think that's like a big one. Another sort of like area where the non-technical skills sort of show up is, how do you actually do you actually sort of understand the goal of what you're trying to do, of what you're building? A lot of people you're sort of like handed a spec and you sort of build that spec, but what are you trying to do with that? And so like better understanding sort of like what goals you're trying to achieve is a very like non-technical area that you need to sort of build up in order to figure out what you should be actually doing.
Right. So far, it's the number one is prioritizing, and number two is kind of seeing the forest from the trees, kind of, and they're hand in hand, right? So I'm thinking of from the school analogy is in an undergraduate or a K-12 curriculum, I guess prioritizing is external in the sense of I have a homework due tomorrow, I have a test tomorrow, so I guess I should just study for that next thing. And the why am I doing this is because I need to get through this class or these 4 classes a semester and pass this, and then I hopefully pass, and then I go to the next set of classes and I hopefully pass, and I keep going until I get my degree. So I guess in college by default, even if we went to MIT, if even in a very rigorous or intensive college environment, you may not get through that very well without being able to prioritize or to understand why you're doing what you need to do, I guess, right?
Right, that's right. I mean, like the next step in school is sort of like usually pretty obvious. It's like there's a fixed curriculum, or like even within a class, there are sort of fixed steps that you have to do. And you don't get as much practice in terms of like figuring out what is given an open-ended problem, how much effort should you actually spend on it? Because maybe you just get your current project done sooner so you can work on something else. In a class, you're generally sort of spending as much time as you want to on a given assignment. There's a deadline, and then once the deadline passes, then you move on to the next thing. That's definitely a lot less true in industry.
Right. Okay. So what's the number 3 one? Building.
Yeah. So number 3 one, I think, is just like underinvesting in yourself. So not really focusing on your own learning. Like I personally just like spend a lot of time reading. Like I probably read, a book a week. And about like 2/3 of that is nonfiction. And that's because there's like so much knowledge that you don't know, right? But like a lot of people have written really good material and like sort of built out really good systems about how to think about the world and like what things will help you succeed. And so I think like definitely investing in yourself, reading a lot, learning a lot, especially early on, can have a lot of compounding effects on your career.
So I guess the meta question there is, this kind of goes with the prioritization and the stepping back thing, is how do you kind of judge what to read, right? Because there are bazillions of books out and articles and besides just books, right? There's like, if you go on the internet, you can waste forever reading all these life hacker things and all these memes about everything. So how do you systematically prioritize and understand what you read to get maximum leverage, right? So that's even a more meta thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm like sort of one book recently I read that I think sort of ties into this is the book Peak by, I think his name is Anderson. But basically it's by the guy who came up with the idea of like deliberate practice and did all his research on deliberate practice. It's like the guy who Malcolm Gladwell popularized the 10,000 hour rule from. And a lot of his book talks about how the fastest way to get really good at something is to make sure you build the right mental models and like build the right vocabulary for thinking about the space you're trying to learn. And the way you do that is by unless you're sort of pioneering the new field and you have to figure out the mental models and like develop them yourself, it's to like talk to experts, right? Talk to people who've done it before, who are like a few steps ahead of you, and actually figure out like what are those mental models, like what books should I be reading, what like things should I be learning in order to like level up my career. And so getting input from like good mentors, good managers, or even like good courses or good books on like sort of what areas to develop next, I think can really sort of accelerate how fast you learn and like where you should be focusing your efforts when you're reading.
Yeah, because it seems like, would you ever recommend reading online article type stuff, or would you only recommend real books so that to prevent yourself from being distracted and to really focus on these high impact things?
I I mean, I think there are lots of like good articles out there too. I think, I think like with both things, like there are good books and there are bad books, right? There are like, um, there are also good articles and bad articles. I think it really depends on sort of the author, like how much effort they spend into it. Is it something that other people found helpful? Like that's probably the best filter, is just like, do your peers or like the people ahead of you, like, do they find this book or do they find this article helpful? And that's sort of a good filter for whether you should be investing your own time into reading it.
Yeah, and I guess another hack that you just mentioned indirectly was this impact in near peers, right? If the peers who are 1 year ahead of you, 2 years ahead of you, said you can approach, if you can find senior coworkers who were at your level a year or two ago, then ask them, then that's one way to hopefully shortcut that process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really high leverage as well, that, you ideally, want to ask like the master of your field something, but you might not get access to them, or they might be too far distant to help you out. But if someone is only a few years ahead of you and you saw that they deliberately took practice to improve, then getting advice from them could be a really, really high leverage thing.
Yep. And that's also partly why, like in fields I know not much about, I'll look for who the experts are and see what books they read, what books they've published, and then in those books, if they mention other people's work, that's, usually goes straight to my like reading list.
All right, so getting back to the practicalities, let's just say a college scene, right? So let's say, actually, let's going back to your own college days, right? How much do you think you did those three things versus not doing them, and how would you have, gone through an ideal college experience to maximize that, given that there's a really rigorous technical curriculum you have to go through, right? It wasn't like you're just sitting on the grass all day. You had to spend most of your effort doing technical stuff for classes, and that's a lot of work. So how do you get the personal development thing on top of that?
Yeah. Trying to think back to sort of my MIT experience and like how much of this I felt like I learned. I felt like the college experience sort of taught me how to focus on learning. So it's more like this meta skill. I think a lot of like the technical things you learn in college, like, aren't actually used in industry. Like I would say most of the material I learned in CS classes probably like, I don't really use on a day-to-day basis. But I think it's the flow you go through of thinking through those types of problems. That's what actually gets applied. There was a great article I read over the weekend about the power of mathematical thinking, which I think is sort of very similar here, which is, when people study math, a lot of the math that you study like isn't actually used anywhere in your day-to-day, except for, like figuring out like the bill, or like how to split the bill among friends for dinner, right? But it's sort of the rigorous training that you go through to study math and the rigorous sort of problem solving that you do in computer science. I think it's that same mindset that then sort of carries over when you work on industry. When I sort of think back to my own college experience, like I don't think I really read that many books outside of what was actually assigned in class. I didn't really sort of invest too much in that area, partly because there's just so much like other work to do. But I think I didn't know how to prioritize doing that at the time. So I think a lot of these skills, really sort of started learning more when I found myself having more time to actually read more and sort of understand like what are the how do you actually like develop these other skills? Like how do you actually figure out what other people want so that you can make sure that what you work on achieves those goals. Or like what else?
Transition. So this is right after college. Let's say after college you finished, you start your first job in industry. When did you get that motivation to want to look into that versus just I'm going to do my job and then chill because I have all this free time now and money and stuff. So when did you get that impetus? Was there some experience that led you to do that, or did you always want to look into that?
That's a good question. I think partly it boils down to right So right after school, I joined Google, and I just learned a ton, even on the technical side, just right after school, just because it was sort of like a big industry experience. But I think one thing that probably a lot of people will find is that their technical learning will plateau after some point, and also sort of furthering your technical skills isn't really the thing that's holding you back the most in your projects, right? It's a project is failing not because your technical skills aren't good enough. I mean, sometimes maybe it is, but most of the time it's maybe there was some communication breakdown, maybe there was a misunderstanding of what the goals of the project should be, or maybe the wrong thing was built. And so I think after probably like a year or two, you start to realize that there's a lot of other inputs into the success of a project besides sort of your own technical skills. And so I think the drive to actually make those projects successful is sort of what starts pushing people to invest in other areas.
Okay, so you were, say, a junior engineer, you're, say, 1 or 2 years out of school working at Google. One could imagine, your peers being like, okay, that's not really my job to do this. I have a team, maybe that's the senior team lead or the manager whose job is to prioritize and do all these things. I'm just going to do my job and kind of coast. What do you think set you apart and that you didn't want to do that and versus maybe people you saw who were okay doing that, and how do you feel that kind of differentiated?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, I personally want to control my own destiny, right? Like, it's not, you could just sort of follow what other people are telling you to do, but if after a while you find out that, okay, what they're telling me to do isn't exactly necessarily the best use of my time, to sort of keep doing that is just sort of accepting like a lower bar for yourself, right? And if you know that you can contribute in other ways, it seems like you just take control of that.
And when did you, was there any kind of foreshadowing of that in your younger life? Because one of these things from talking to people is I kind of suss out, there's something where they start differentiating themselves from many of their peers. And it seems like this is one of your moments of you're at your first company and then you think, all right, I want to start taking more control and personal leadership, even though I am a junior engineer, but I want to take more personal leadership of my own work and maybe others' work. Did you have a will to do that when you were younger, or did you only grow into that, in your first industry job, or how did that come about?
I felt like I had a pretty, I didn't have a tiger mom, but I had fairly I would say academically driven sort of Asian upbringing. And I think as a kid, it's probably, as a kid in school, I think it's very clear what you need to do to excel academically. I think in industry, it's definitely less clear. I think companies will have career ladders that you can sort of look at to say, okay, if I wanted to move to the next level, I should basically be hitting these requirements. But oftentimes, even those are sort of not that well defined. And so, I think a lot of it is just, wanting to be better, and then going to figure out what actually it takes to become better. I think there are definitely a lot of good writing out there. There's a lot of good writing out there that sort of can show you a roadmap or a guideline of how to get better. But impetus is still on you to sort of seek those out.
So I guess starting on the flip side, because I'm sure you've talked to many people who across the spectrum of personal initiative in their work and stuff, what do you feel like are the common kind of anti-patterns of people who would maybe just decide to cruise because they're like, maybe it's too hard to try to improve, or maybe the structure at my current organization makes it so that if I try to push forward, it will just be futile and stuff. What do you feel like are, I'm trying to brainstorm on the negative end, right? Obviously, you're talking about the positive end of you can try to take charge of your own career technically and developmentally, and you have these principles, these 3 principles that you're going by. what do you feel are kind of the failure cases there? I mean, quote unquote, of people plateauing too early, and why would people decide maybe to do that?
I mean, I think a lot of times uh, sometimes it's like you feel like your work is not the most important focus of your life. Um, I think that is probably one common mindset that people have. The flip side of that argument is that, given that you're spending, probably like 40 hours a week on your work, even if it's not sort of like the most exciting thing in your life, it seems like you should make the best of it, and try to learn as much as you can. I think like another common reason that holds people back is just having a fixed mindset about their skills. So believing that they can't get better because they just lack the innate talent to get better. There's a lot of research that Carol Dweck has done on sort of nature of mindset and like people who have a fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, and the people who believe that the qualities they have are fixed and innate, end up giving up on problems sooner because they feel like their failures are just a reflection of a lack of innate skill, whereas people who have a growth mindset sort of see those failures as, oh, okay, I just need to practice more, I need to improve more. And so I think there's some set of people who, because they have a fixed mindset toward their skill sets, end up giving up a lot earlier than they should. And I think like developing this sort of growth mindset toward your abilities is sort of one like important step to getting out of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is huge. I mean, this is a fairly universal thing that a lot of people are talking about. And, and I think another thing that I think about that's related to this is kind of the path dependence on what our early experiences are, right? So sometimes one explanation is that if someone happens to be in a bad organization when they start their first job, or in a bad team or something, and they try to do a bunch of stuff, and they're really, assuming everyone starts off with a lot of energy and initiative, at 21 years old, the people who are happened by some kind of chance or luck or whatever getting placed on a bad team within even the same company versus on a better team with better dynamics, if they try to do stuff and they're stifled, then maybe they kind of have that, that negative reinforcement. They're like, maybe I don't really care as much anymore. And then if they try again and it still doesn't work, I see this a lot with, in a lot of settings, like in research and a lot of, anything that's creative and hard. If you happen to have bad early experiences, that could really stifle you. And, yes, if you had a really good growth mindset, you could overcome that, but it's just kind of more of a burden, right? That, so, and I guess brainstorming on that, how would you think about, I guess the advice for college students, right? You're a senior in college, you're evaluating your first job. A lot of times you may not get a lot of choice in terms of what exactly you're working on because it's your first job out of college. How would you kind of think about giving advice to students to optimize that? Or should they not worry about that and just do something and learn something and then move on? That kind of importance of your first few years out of work, because that's when you're learning perhaps the most in the real world.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important question. I mean, you've probably heard the saying, like you're the average of the 5 of the closest or people that you work with, right? And so I think the environment that you work in is definitely very important in terms of shaping both like how you work and your own mindsets. I think like if you maybe when you graduate from college and you don't get a job offer at the place that you want, I would spend energy focusing on, what would it take to secure a job offer at a company whose reputation that you actually care more for, right? I mean, even for like colleges, right? There are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, right out of high school, maybe they didn't go to as good of a high school, they couldn't get to a top college, and so they go to a state college, community college, and then after 2 years, after sort of demonstrating that they can perform well, then they transfer later to a better college. I think like similar sort of mindset, similar flow can happen in industry. You maybe when you graduate, maybe your grades aren't that great, and so you don't get accepted into one of the like stronger companies. Develop a plan, like what are the areas that you need to improve on, and train to sort of get your foot in the door into onto a stronger team, because once you make that transition, your learning rate will be a lot faster.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I mean, one of my kind of mental models for a lot of this is that your time in your younger years are really precious, right? As now we're in our early 30s, those, that those 2 years between, or 3 years, say, 3 years between, 21 and 24 are so much more precious than like a random 3 years in your 40s or 50s, right? Because those are the really formative years. And there is somewhat of a sense of urgency because, I guess the first decade, right, out of college, right, from 20 to 30, you could see people's, trajectories go really differently. People, like you said, people might plateau really early. Some people might continually grow, and those effects start compounding because as we get older, one thing we notice is that there's just more inertia and drag, just kind of personally and, family situations and more demand for money and things that it is, I think people are less mobile, right? So I think that targeting that college age student or young, early employees in terms of, changing and affecting trajectory I think it's absolutely the right place.
Yeah, and also I want to point out, I mean, even though we're sort of talking in the context of like transitioning from one company to another, I mean, I think really the focus is develop a plan so that you're actually learning and developing yourself, whether it's for your career or just for like other things, right? Like I think there's probably a ton of learning that you can do just from exploring the world more, like putting yourself in situations that are outside of your comfort zone, sort of challenging yourself. And I think all of those experiences, even if they're sort of not really career oriented, will sort of make you more successful in the long run because they're helping you develop skills that will be useful. They sort of open your mind more to different ways that you can grow, and they're really just sort of helping you build like a much stronger growth mindset that you can use to later sort of tackle whatever goals you want to tackle.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That it's holistic, right? It's not just, what engineering things can I study? What communication thing can I study for work? What, teamwork thing can I study? It's the kind of building yourself as a more well-rounded and diverse person.
Right.
And, the cliche goes that, it is always easier to do these things when you're younger. I mean, you can obviously do them when you're older too. But I think if you build up a habit of that when you're younger, then you'll sustain that as you age. You'll keep that curiosity up and that kind of drive to be like, all right, every year, let's take one trip and learn one interesting thing. Let's do one international trip so we can learn the culture. And if you don't do that when you're young, it's very hard to imagine all of a sudden doing that in your 30s or 40s if you never had a habit.
Yeah, you did talk about habits like about like 3 years ago, started doing this habit where every year my wife and I would we would basically visit 3 countries, and we would also aim for like one overnight trip somewhere a month. And that's been a good like forcing function to just get us outside of what we normally do so that we can go like explore other places. And like building that habit, basically like kicking that off. I mean, in the beginning, it took a lot of work, but now it's sort of just more on autopilot.
Yeah, and it becomes a tradition too, which is
Right.
really nice. Yeah, I think that's a whole other giant topic of the mindset and psychology of habit building, which is a whole other giant topic. Alrighty, so we should wrap up pretty soon. It's around half an hour. So I guess the final word would be, I guess you already cover a lot of advice for students and stuff, but yeah, usually what I'd ask is what advice would you have for for someone coming up, but you've been talking about that a lot. I mean, do you have final profound thoughts on this topic that we have not covered yet? Since you covered a lot of
I mean, if it's sort of like advice for students, I would say that probably the last piece of advice would be pay more attention to relationships and investing in them. I think that's one thing that can be easy to overlook. So just sort of like in school, like really easy to just sort of connect with people in the same dorm, like they're just sort of right across the hall, or like connect with people in class. I think after you leave school, it becomes, you can still definitely do it and you should, but it definitely takes a lot more energy to sort of meet and connect with people. And so I think building, maintaining relationships that you have in college, just like practicing the practice of building relationships, I think is sort of like another useful habit or skill that sort of will help you in the long run.
Alrighty, you all heard it here first from Edmond. It's something that our parents always tell us, but it's more credible somehow when it comes from someone who is more in the same generation. And yeah, it's something my parents always told me, but I never really took it to heart because it's like, oh, older people are telling me this. Yeah, whatever. But it does make a lot of sense as we grow older that it's like that Turning 30 survey I did last year. Like one of the things from that survey, which I'll send a link on the website about, which was I surveyed like 100 or 200 people who are friends and acquaintances about what they felt was different now that they're 30 versus when they were 20, right, from college. And one of the biggest things people mentioned was that keeping up long-term meaningful relationships with people is so important, yet it's so challenging.
Yep.
Right? It's more and more of a challenge as you get older, as your life progresses and more stuff gets in it. Whereas in college, it was just so easy, like you said, to go next door and everything was just so much more fluid. So that's awesome advice. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Edmond. We will go offline and chat a bit more, but thanks so much.
Cool. Thanks, Phil.